Welcome to Life Stories, where we bring you tales of love, resilience, and the unexpected twists that shape our lives. Today's story takes us into the high-stakes world of ambition and deception, where a powerful executive and an unassuming woman form an unlikely alliance. Together, they navigate a journey filled with challenges, personal growth, and the search for something real amidst chaos. Don't miss out on this emotional and inspiring tale. Subscribe now to Life Stories and join us as we delve into a story of trust, redemption, and the courage to embrace new beginnings. Let's start the journey today. The world of Ethan Parker was one of precision, power, and control. Every move he made was calculated, every decision measured. From his sleek office in the heart of Chicago, Ethan seemed untouchable. A man who had it all. But the facade of perfection began to crack the moment he opened the wedding invitation. Sitting at his desk, the glossy card in his hand felt heavier than it should have. The embossed gold letters gleamed under the soft light, spelling out the name of his ex-fiancée, Charlotte Whitmore. She was getting married to a banker. Of all people. Ethan's jaw tightened as he read the details. Charlotte's wedding in the Hamptons would be the event of the season. It wasn't just the sting of her moving on that gnawed at him, it was the thought of her seeing him as defeated. She had once said he would never change, that he was too consumed by ambition to truly care for anyone. Now, she was marrying someone she described as stable, a word that Ethan couldn't help but resent. He tossed the card onto his desk and exhaled sharply, pacing across the room. The floor-to-ceiling windows framed a city that never stopped moving, much like Ethan himself. Yet, for the first time in years, he felt stuck. He didn't just want to attend Charlotte's wedding, he wanted to show her that he was thriving. Not just surviving. But how? The answer came to him unexpectedly when Grace Walker knocked on the door to deliver a folder of invoices. Grace, his maid of 2 years, was always polite. Always discreet. Her presence was a quiet constant in the background of his fast-paced life. That day, as she stood in her modest uniform, Ethan's sharp mind saw an opportunity. She was nothing like the women who frequented his world, there was a raw authenticity about her. She wasn't just another polished, poised socialite, she was real. "Leave it on the desk," Ethan said curtly, but then an idea sparked. "Wait," he added, his tone softening. Grace froze, unsure of what he wanted. "Is something wrong, sir?" He studied her for a moment, the wheels in his mind turning. "How long have you worked for me?" 2 years, she replied, her brow furrowing in confusion. "You're loyal, discreet, professional," he stated, almost as if ticking off a list in his head. "I need someone to accompany me to an event this weekend." Grace's confusion deepened. An event? A wedding, he clarified, his tone nonchalant. Charlotte Whitmore's wedding. The folder she was holding nearly slipped from her hands. She'd overheard whispers about Charlotte among the staff but had never dared to ask. "I don't understand." "Why me?" "Because you're different," Ethan said simply. "You're not like them." He gestured vaguely, as if referring to an invisible crowd of high society elites. "You're authentic." "That's exactly what I need." Grace shook her head, backing away slightly. "Mr. Parker, I'm your maid, not your date." "It's not a date," he replied sharply. "It's a business arrangement. I'll pay you generously. All you have to do is attend the wedding with me, look presentable, and make Charlotte believe I've moved on." Her lips parted in disbelief. "You're asking me to pretend to be someone I'm not. I'm asking you to help me deliver a message," Ethan corrected, his gaze unwavering. "That's all." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken tension. Grace's instincts screamed at her to walk away, to refuse outright. But then she thought of her overdue rent, the mounting letters from her mother back in Ohio asking for help, and the dream she had of opening her own cafe, a dream that felt increasingly out of reach. Ethan's offer, though absurd, was a chance to ease some of those burdens. Finally, she spoke, her voice trembling. "This is ridiculous. I don't belong in your world. And I don't want to be dragged into whatever this is." Her defiance caught Ethan off guard. And for a brief moment, he admired her tenacity. But he wasn't one to back down. "You have bills to pay, don't you?" he said, his voice low and pointed. "Dreams you've put on hold? Let me make it worth your while." Grace hesitated, her pride wrestling with practicality. The truth was, she needed the money. And as much as she hated the idea of being part of Ethan's game, the promise of financial stability was too tempting to ignore. "All right," she said finally, her voice tinged with reluctance. "But just this once." A faint smile curved Ethan's lips, a glimmer of satisfaction in his otherwise stoic expression. "Good. We'll start tomorrow." As Grace left his office that evening, her mind was a whirlwind of doubts and questions. She couldn't believe she had agreed to such a ridiculous scheme. And yet, beneath her frustration, there was a flicker of curiosity. What kind of man would go to such lengths to prove a point? And why did she feel that this was about more than just Charlotte? In the quiet of her small apartment that night, Grace stared at her reflection in the mirror. She didn't recognize the woman staring back. "What have I gotten myself into?" she whispered, the weight of her decision settling heavily on her chest. Tomorrow, she would step into Ethan Parker's world, a world of power, deception, and high-stakes games, and she could only hope that she would emerge unscathed. The next morning, Grace regretted her decision almost immediately. At precisely 8 a.m., a sleek black car arrived at her modest apartment, whisking her away to an exclusive boutique in the heart of Chicago. The gleaming storefront, with its gold lettering and champagne flutes on silver trays, screamed a level of luxury she'd never imagined entering. She stepped out hesitantly, feeling entirely out of place among the glossy floors and racks of designer gowns. A stern-faced stylist greeted her, assessing her with an appraising gaze that made Grace want to shrink into the ground. "Miss Walker, we have our work cut out for us," the woman said crisply. Without waiting for a response, she snapped her fingers, summoning an army of assistants who began pulling dresses from racks, twisting her hair into elaborate styles, and slipping impossibly high heels onto her feet. Each moment felt more surreal than the last. Grace stood frozen in front of a mirror as fabric after fabric was draped over her, the sheer opulence of it all making her head spin. "Do people actually live like this?" she thought, her fingers gripping the sides of a chair for balance as yet another assistant tightened a corset. Hours later, Ethan arrived, his presence commanding even in the chaos of the boutique. Dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, he surveyed the scene like an artist inspecting a nearly completed masterpiece. Grace bristled under his critical gaze as he examined her outfit, a pale blue gown with intricate beading. He shook his head slightly, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Not quite," he said, motioning for the stylist to bring over another gown. A sleek emerald green dress was handed to her, its bold color a stark contrast to the muted tones she had worn before. Grace stepped into the dress reluctantly, the soft fabric molding to her figure perfectly. When she emerged from the dressing room, the room fell silent. Ethan's usual air of detachment faltered for just a moment. His piercing gaze softened as he took her in, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. "Perfect," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. Grace crossed her arms, her discomfort evident. "I hope this is enough to impress your ex," she said flatly. Ethan's smirk returned, the mask of composure snapping back into place. "Trust me, it will." By the time the day ended, Grace was utterly exhausted. She had been poked, prodded, and transformed into someone she barely recognized. As she returned to her small apartment, her reflection in the mirror startled her. The woman staring back at her was poised and elegant, a stranger in every sense of the word. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Ethan: "Be ready by 6 p.m. tomorrow." This is just the beginning. Grace exhaled shakily, the weight of the situation settling heavily on her chest. She had stepped into a world that wasn't hers. A world she didn't understand. And as much as she tried to convince herself that this was just a temporary arrangement, a growing part of her couldn't shake the feeling that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't foresee. The evening of the wedding arrived with an air of tension Grace couldn't ignore. She stood in front of her mirror, smoothing the fabric of the emerald gown Ethan had chosen for her. The reflection staring back seemed almost regal, her hair swept into an elegant chignon, her makeup flawless. But her trembling hands betrayed the nerves tightening her chest. She didn't belong in this world of chandeliers and champagne. But here she was, about to face it head-on. The black car arrived promptly at 6 p.m., and as she stepped outside, the cool Chicago breeze did little to calm her. Ethan was already waiting by the car, his tailored tuxedo fitting him perfectly, exuding power and confidence. For a brief moment, his sharp blue eyes softened when he saw her. "You clean up well," he said, offering his arm. "And you don't look half bad yourself," Grace replied, her voice edged with sarcasm to mask her nerves. The car ride to the venue was quiet, the city flashing by in a blur of lights. Grace stole glances at Ethan, who stared out the window with a stoic expression. Beneath his calm exterior, she could sense a storm brewing. Whatever unresolved feelings he had about Victoria, they were hidden well beneath his carefully composed demeanor. When they arrived at the venue, a sprawling estate with glittering fountains and manicured gardens, Grace felt her breath hitch. This wasn't just a wedding, it was a spectacle of wealth and opulence. Guests in designer gowns and tailored suits milled about, their laughter carrying over the soft music of a live quartet. "Breathe," Ethan said softly as they stepped out of the car. He leaned closer, his voice a steady anchor in the chaos. "You're with me. Walk in like you belong." Grace nodded, drawing strength from his calm. They entered the grand hall, and immediately, she felt the weight of 100 eyes. Whispers rippled through the crowd as they passed, the elegant woman on Ethan Pierce's arm sparking curiosity and speculation. The moment they approached the reception area, the energy shifted. There, amidst the glittering crowd, stood Victoria, resplendent in a designer wedding gown, her smile poised and perfect. For a fleeting moment, her eyes met Ethan's, and a flicker of something unspoken passed between them. Then her gaze shifted to Grace, the smile faltering ever so slightly. Victoria approached, her expression carefully neutral. "Ethan," she greeted, her voice honeyed but edged with steel. "I didn't expect to see you here. And miss your special day," Ethan replied smoothly, his tone dripping with polite detachment. "I wouldn't dream of it." Victoria's gaze lingered on Grace, her smile tightening. "And who is this?" "Grace Walker," Ethan said firmly. "My partner." The word hung in the air, deliberate and heavy. Victoria's eyes narrowed, her composure slipping for just a moment before she recovered. "A pleasure," she said, extending a hand. Grace shook it, her grip firm despite the turmoil churning inside her. The tension between the trio was palpable, a silent battle of unspoken words and simmering emotions. Grace could feel Ethan's resolve harden beside her, his hand resting protectively on her back. She had walked into a battlefield of power and pretense, and there was no turning back. The aftermath of the wedding unraveled with the swiftness of a storm, leaving Grace reeling from its impact. By the next morning, her phone buzzed incessantly with notifications, the names of gossip blogs flashing across the screen. Whispers from the wedding had transformed into full-blown rumors. Her photo, hand in hand with Ethan Pierce, graced every headline. Who was this mysterious woman? Ethan Pierce's secret girlfriend? A power couple in the making? The speculation was endless. And for Grace, it was overwhelming. She sat in her small kitchen, her laptop open to one of the many articles dissecting her presence at the wedding. The comments were worse. A stream of opinions from strangers who had no idea who she was. Words like gold digger and social climber stung the most. She wasn't any of those things. but trying to prove it felt futile. A sharp knock at the door startled her. She hesitated, then opened it to find Ethan standing there, his face a mask of calm determination. He was dressed impeccably as always, but his usual composure was laced with tension. "May I come in?" he asked. Grace stepped aside, crossing her arms as he entered. "I assume you've seen the headlines." Ethan nodded, his expression dark. "I have. This isn't how I wanted things to go," she scoffed, her frustration spilling over. "You think I'm being dragged through the mud while you sit in your office, sipping scotch? That's not fair," he said sharply, his tone carrying an edge of regret. "This isn't just affecting you, Grace. Investors are calling me non-stop. My board is asking questions. And Nathan," he trailed off, his jaw tightening. Grace's frustration gave way to curiosity. "What about Nathan?" Ethan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "He's behind this. I'm sure of it. He's been waiting for a chance to strike. And now he's using you to get to me." The weight of his words settled over her. Grace sank into a chair, her shoulders slumping. "So what now? You fight him with more rumors and backdoor deals?" "No," Ethan said firmly, sitting across from her. "We fight him with the truth." Grace raised an eyebrow. "The truth? And what's that?" "Exactly. That you were at the wedding as my guest." "Nothing more," he said, his gaze steady. "That you've been working on a sustainability project for my company, something we'll make public soon. I won't let him destroy your reputation." "Grace, you have my word." Her heart twisted at his sincerity. For all his faults, Ethan seemed genuinely determined to protect her. But trust was a fragile thing. And their relationship, if it could even be called that, was built on shaky ground. "Why are you doing this?" she asked quietly. "Why not just cut your losses and let me go?" Ethan leaned forward, his expression softening. "Because I dragged you into this. And because I need you, Grace. Not just for the fight, but for me." The vulnerability in his voice caught her off guard. Against her better judgment, she nodded. "All right. What's the plan?" Ethan's lips curved into a faint smile. "We start by confronting Nathan. Together." The grand gala loomed like a battlefield, its opulence masking the underlying tension that simmered beneath the surface. Grace stood in her small apartment, staring at the emerald green gown draped across her bed. Ethan had it delivered earlier that day, along with a note that simply read, "Be ready. Tonight is the first move." She hesitated before slipping into the dress. It was stunning, tailored to perfection. And yet it felt like armor, an unspoken acknowledgement of the war she was about to walk into. As she pinned up her hair and applied a final swipe of lipstick, her stomach churned with unease. She wasn't ready for this. But then again, when had she ever been ready for anything in Ethan Pierce's world? A sleek black car arrived promptly at 8. Ethan was already inside, his tailored tuxedo impeccable, his expression unreadable. He didn't say much as she climbed in, but his gaze lingered on her, softening for just a moment before he turned back to his phone. As they approached the venue, a historic building glowing under the city lights, Grace's anxiety spiked. The steps leading to the grand entrance were lined with photographers, their cameras flashing like lightning. Ethan offered her his arm, and she took it reluctantly, her hand trembling slightly in his. "Head high. Grace," he murmured. "You belong here." She wasn't so sure, but she nodded and forced a confident smile as they walked past the gauntlet of onlookers. Inside, the ballroom was a spectacle of wealth and power, chandeliers casting a warm glow, tables adorned with extravagant centerpieces, and a sea of finely dressed socialites mingling with glasses of champagne in hand. The moment they entered, Nathan Steele's gaze found them. He was standing by the bar, his posture casual but his eyes sharp. He raised his glass in mock salute, a smug smirk playing on his lips. "Ethan," Nathan drawled as they approached, his voice dripping with feigned warmth. "What a pleasant surprise. And who is this vision at your side?" Ethan's grip on Grace's arm tightened ever so slightly. "Grace Winters," he said coolly. "I believe you've heard of her." Nathan's smirk widened as his gaze swept over Grace. Lingering a second too long. "Ah. Yes. The woman everyone's been talking about. I must say, you've created quite a stir." Grace met his stare with steady defiance. "Rumors tend to do that." Nathan chuckled. Clearly amused. "Feisty. I like her. Ethan. A bit out of your usual league. Though. Isn't she?" Ethan stepped forward. His tone cold and measured. "Careful. Nathan. Your wit might overshadow your tact." The tension between them was palpable. The air around them crackling with unspoken animosity. Grace felt like a pawn in their game. But she refused to be reduced to a mere spectator. Nathan leaned closer. His voice lowering. "You're in over your head. Ethan. Walk away while you still can." Ethan's jaw tightened. Not a chance. The standoff ended as abruptly as it began, with Nathan retreating into the crowd. But Grace knew this was far from over. The night had only just begun. The car ride back to Ethan's penthouse was steeped in a tense silence. Grace sat rigidly in her seat. Her hands folded tightly in her lap as the events of the gala replayed in her mind. She could still feel the weight of Nathan's gaze. The subtle threat laced in his words. As they pulled up to the building, Ethan finally broke the silence. "Don't let him intimidate you," he said. His voice firm but calm. "Nathan thrives on fear. It's how he controls people." Grace turned to him. Her voice steady despite the knot of unease in her chest. "What if he's right? What if I'm out of my depth?" Ethan's gaze softened. The hard edges of his usual demeanor fading for just a moment. "You're not. You're stronger than you think." She wanted to believe him. But the gnawing doubt wouldn't let go. As they entered the penthouse, Ethan immediately moved to his desk, his focus shifting to his laptop. Grace stood awkwardly by the window, staring out at the city lights. The tension between them was almost as suffocating as the uncertainty of what lay ahead. Her phone buzzed in her bag, pulling her from her thoughts. The message on the screen made her blood run cold. "You don't belong here. Leave while you can." Her hands trembled as she stared at the words. The number was unknown, but the message was clear. Swallowing her fear, she crossed the room and held the phone out to Ethan. "Look at this." He took the phone, his expression darkening as he read the message. "Did you recognize the number?" "No," Grace said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What does it mean? Who sent this?" Ethan's jaw tightened as he handed the phone back to her. "It's a warning. Someone trying to scare you or us." The calm authority in his voice didn't comfort her. If anything, it made the danger feel more real. "And what if it's not just a warning?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What if they're serious?" "They won't touch you," Ethan said firmly, his eyes locking onto hers. "I'll make sure of it." Grace wanted to believe him, but the icy fear in her chest wouldn't relent. "I didn't ask for any of this," she said, her voice breaking. "I just wanted to help my family, to make something of myself. I didn't sign up for threats and power games." Ethan stepped closer, his expression uncharacteristically vulnerable. "I know," he said quietly, "and I hate that you've been dragged into this. But I promise you, Grace, I'll protect you." She looked up at him, searching his face for any sign of doubt. There was none. And yet, the weight of the situation was suffocating. The warnings, the games, the risks, it was too much. But as much as she wanted to walk away, something deeper rooted her in place. For the rest of the night, the penthouse felt like a fortress, and Grace couldn't shake the feeling that the battle was just beginning. The following morning arrived under a sky thick with heavy clouds, casting an ominous light over the city. Grace sat in the penthouse's sunlit kitchen, staring blankly at a cup of tea growing colder by the minute. The weight of the unknown pressed down on her. She couldn't shake the memory of the threatening message, its words echoing in her mind. Ethan walked in, his sharp suit in place, But there was a new tension in his stride. He moved with purpose, his eyes scanning a folder he held tightly. Grace looked up, her voice cutting through the silence. "What now?" "We end this," Ethan said, setting the folder down on the kitchen counter. His tone was sharp, but there was something beneath it, determination tinged with desperation. "I've called a meeting with Nathan." Grace's heart sank. "A meeting? Ethan. He's dangerous. You can't just confront him." He met her gaze, his expression steely. "I have to. He's already gone too far. If I let this slide, he'll keep pushing until there's nothing left." She stood, crossing her arms. "And what happens if he doesn't back down? If he doubles down instead?" Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I have evidence," he said, motioning to the folder. "It's enough to ruin him. Fraud, embezzlement, illegal dealings, it's all here. If he tries to retaliate, I'll make it public." Grace stared at him, her unease growing. "You're betting everything on this." "I am," Ethan admitted. "Because it's the only way to protect us." Us. The word hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Grace looked away, her emotions a storm she couldn't name. She wanted to argue, to tell him he was being reckless. But deep down, she knew he was right. This was the only way to end it. "When is this meeting?" she asked, her voice quieter now. "Tonight," Ethan said, his jaw tightening. "At a neutral location. Somewhere he can't pull any tricks." The hours leading up to the meeting passed in a blur. Ethan worked tirelessly with his legal team, refining his plan and preparing for every possible outcome. Grace stayed by his side, feeling more like a spectator than a participant. She watched as he transformed into the calculated strategist she had come to know, focused, unrelenting, and coldly efficient. By the time evening arrived, the tension in the air was suffocating. Ethan stood by the door, adjusting his cufflinks as Grace approached. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I have to be," he said, his expression softening as he looked at her. "Stay here, Grace. No matter what happens, stay safe." She nodded reluctantly, her stomach in knots. "Just, be careful." Ethan offered a faint smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "I will." As the door closed behind him, Grace sank onto the couch, her heart pounding. She didn't know what would happen next. But one thing was clear, everything was about to change. The hours ticked by like centuries, each moment dragging Grace deeper into her own anxious thoughts. The silence of the penthouse seemed to amplify every sound, her own breathing, the faint hum of the city below, the occasional click of her phone as she checked for messages from Ethan. She couldn't bring herself to sit still, pacing the spacious living room as questions swirled in her mind. What if Nathan didn't back down? What if Ethan's plan failed? What if? Her phone buzzed, breaking through the storm of her thoughts. She lunged for it, her heart racing. But it wasn't Ethan. It was a single text from an unknown number. Tick-tock. "Grace. Time's running out." She felt the air leave her lungs, her chest tightening with dread. Without thinking, she dialed Ethan. But the call went straight to voicemail. The weight of the message pressed down on her, the chilling reminder that this wasn't just a game, it was a war. And she was caught in the crossfire. Another hour passed before the sound of the penthouse door opening startled her. She spun around to see Ethan walking in, his expression unreadable. He was carrying the same folder he'd taken earlier, but his shoulders looked less tense, his stride more deliberate. "What happened?" Grace asked, rushing to him. Ethan set the folder down on the counter, exhaling deeply. "It's over," he said, his voice steady. Nathan backed down. Her eyes widened. "What did you do?" "I laid it all out," he said, meeting her gaze. "Every piece of evidence. I made it clear that if he didn't step back, his entire empire would crumble. He didn't have a choice." Grace felt relief wash over her. But it was quickly replaced by another wave of unease. And what about his threats? What about the people he's working with? Ethan's jaw tightened, a flicker of anger crossing his face. I made it clear that if anyone comes after us again, they'll regret it. He knows I'm not bluffing. She searched his face for any sign of doubt. But Ethan Bennett was nothing if not resolute. He believed in his victory. And for the first time in weeks, Grace found herself daring to believe it too. What now? She asked softly. Ethan leaned against the counter, his gaze drifting to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Now, we figure out what comes next, he said, his voice quieter. For so long, I've been fighting, first to build this company, then to protect it. I don't know who I am without the battle. Grace stepped closer, her voice gentle. Maybe it's time to stop fighting, to let yourself just live. He looked at her, his blue eyes softer than she'd ever seen them. And what about you? After everything I've dragged you into, do you even want to be part of this world anymore? Her chest tightened, a mix of emotions rushing through her. I don't know what the future holds, Ethan, she said honestly, but I know I don't want to face it alone. For the first time, a genuine smile broke across Ethan's face, a smile that wasn't calculated or rehearsed, but real. He reached for her hand, his grip warm and steady. Then let's figure it out together. As the city lights flickered below, Grace felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. This wasn't just an ending, it was a beginning. A chance to rebuild. Not just their lives, but something far greater. Together. As the sun set over the city, Ethan and Grace stood side by side, looking out over the glittering skyline. Their journey had been one of unexpected twists, battles fought, and bonds forged. Though the future remained uncertain, they had found something rare: trust, and the courage to start anew. Together, they would embrace what lay ahead, knowing they were stronger for the challenges they had faced. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories for more heartwarming tales of love, resilience, and life's profound lessons. See you in the next story.